Welcome to Session 2. This training section focuses on policies for both volunteers and clients. In Session 2, we will cover the following topics: volunteer policies, safety policies, and customer service and passenger policies. The SourcePoint Transportation Program is committed to providing a safe, quality service for our passengers and the volunteers who make this program possible. To ensure this commitment, the program adheres to the following standards and guidelines for staff and volunteers. SourcePoint's transportation program will provide safe, reliable, and efficient service. Volunteer drivers are responsible for abiding by the policies detailed in the transportation program training. This is necessary for the liability protection of volunteers, passengers, and this agency. Volunteers representing our program will take their volunteer work seriously by honoring codes of conduct and confidentiality of passengers. Volunteers have the right to accept or deny requests made of them by SourcePoint staff. However, accepting a request to provide a ride for someone requires the volunteer to be responsible for on-time service and follow-through of assignment. Volunteers will communicate with clients and with SourcePoint staff members clearly and within appropriate timeframes. Volunteers should report any passenger concerns, trip changes, or unusual occurrences to the in-home care volunteer program specialist. Volunteers will obey all traffic laws and have the right to insist that passengers will also obey laws and safety rules. The SourcePoint Transportation Program is committed to providing the opportunity for volunteers to attend training and to encourage volunteer involvement in the development and implementation of this transportation program. Opinions and suggestions from volunteers will be considered and honored when practical. Volunteers must submit to a BCI background check and Ohio Bureau of Motor Vehicles abstract driving record check. While on duty, volunteers must abide by SourcePoint's alcohol and drug-free policy by never driving under the influence of a controlled substance, alcohol, or medications that affect driving abilities. All client-facing volunteers submit to a background check via the Bureau of Criminal Investigation. Likely you have already been cleared after submitting to fingerprinting at volunteer orientation. The driving records of all prospective volunteers with driving assignments will be checked prior to activation and annually thereafter. Please refer to your volunteer handbook for what constitutes an ineligible driving record. Prior to activation, volunteer drivers must provide proof of automobile liability insurance. Please refer to the volunteer handbook for insurance requirements. Proof of automobile insurance coverage is required annually. Volunteers will be suspended from their driving assignment for committing certain offenses, including but not limited to the following: acts of theft, acts of violence, reporting to volunteering while under the influence of a controlled substance, alcohol, or medications that affect driving abilities based on the standards of the Drug-Free Workplace Act, violations of program confidentiality or conflicts of interest policies, violations of the Driver Code of Conduct, suspension of or loss of driver's license or insurance, including failure to obtain proper amounts of insurance as established by SourcePoint's transportation program, repeated at-fault collisions or a single serious at-fault collision, false documentation of program records, violation of agency ethics policy, or violation of the agency harassment policy. Volunteer supervisors will attempt to provide further education and training when there are ongoing difficulties related to procedural issues. However, volunteers may be terminated for continued lack of procedural compliance after training. Volunteer training for medical transportation includes these online educational modules: an in-person one-on-one session to get any questions answered, and occasional meetings or gatherings to provide volunteers with updates or to have some fun. It is essential that all vehicles used to transport SourcePoint clients are safe and in good condition. Volunteers should adhere to the following guidelines. All vehicles used to transport SourcePoint clients must be well maintained and meet or exceed safe operating standards, including tire tread and pressure at manufacturer thresholds, operable exterior lights, windshield wipers in good condition, and window tint should not exceed the legal threshold for Ohio. Volunteers will sign a vehicle maintenance agreement which states that their vehicle will meet or exceed safe operating standards at any time that they are transporting a SourcePoint client. This sample pre-trip inspection form is provided in your training handbook. It is the volunteer's responsibility to review the form prior to transporting clients and to ensure that the vehicle is safe for on-road service. Volunteers are not required to complete the checklist, but should ensure that their vehicle meets the standards described. Questions regarding a concern, a defect, or any issue that may impact the performance of the vehicle for a scheduled trip must be reported to the volunteer supervisor who will assess the situation. Prohibited activities while driving a client include smoking, vaping, eating or drinking, road rage or inappropriate language, and electronic devices. However, taking a sip of coffee or water while the vehicle is stopped is okay. Remember that your passenger might be anxious about driving with someone new and will appreciate your eyes and attention on the road. Volunteers are required to carry a personal cell phone that is always powered on when transporting a client, but please refrain from using cell phones while passengers are on board or while in the company of a client who needs your attention. In the case of an emergency, pull off the road before taking or making the call. SourcePoint doesn't share volunteer phone numbers, but volunteers must call clients to plan transports and your number may be visible to clients. Otherwise, the choice to share your phone number with a client is up to you. Transportation volunteers are required to dress in compliance with the SourcePoint dress code described in the volunteer handbook while representing SourcePoint out in the community. In addition to other requirements, volunteers should wear shoes with good tread since they might be responsible for pushing wheelchairs or providing light support to their passengers. It is the responsibility of the driver to ensure that all individuals in the vehicle wear safety belts while on SourcePoint business. Passengers with a written seatbelt exemption from a doctor should be encouraged to sit in the back seat. First aid kits are provided for volunteers to keep in their vehicle and readily available. Kits include bandages, gauze, alcohol wipes, and disposable gloves, which should be replenished frequently. Please return the kit when your service in this area ends. Volunteers are never expected to start or complete a transport if the client is being physical with or shouting at others in the vehicle, using threatening language, swearing excessively, or conducting any other negative behavior. Steps for dealing with a disruptive, abusive passenger include, while driving, give a verbal warning to stop the negative behavior. Pull over, stop the vehicle, and issue a second verbal warning. If the volunteer's safety is at risk, the volunteer should exit the vehicle and call 911. If the severity of the negative behavior is not threatening to the volunteer's safety, the volunteer should call their volunteer supervisor for instructions about next steps. If the volunteer supervisor is not available, call the main SourcePoint number and explain that you have an urgent situation involving a client. Any client behavior that a volunteer considers abusive or disruptive must be reported to their volunteer supervisor and followed up with an incident report. SourcePoint management will be responsible for determining the consequences and enforcement as a result of such behavior. Since clients are screened by their care consultants for appropriateness to use this program, disruptive and abusive behaviors are rarely a problem. Most disruptive behavior stems from anxiety. Examples include fidgeting with buttons and adjusting the visor. These types of disruptive behaviors can typically be controlled by redirecting the client's attention. If that fails, a direct request is acceptable, like, "Mary, I want to make sure I get you to your appointment safely and on time. It's distracting when you adjust the visor. Would you mind stopping? Let's talk more about..." Volunteers should never feel obligated to drive if roads are hazardous or foul weather threatens driver or passenger safety. If weather conditions require that a volunteer seek safety, they should do so immediately. If possible, volunteers should call the volunteer supervisor and notify SourcePoint of their situation and whereabouts. In an emergency, call 911. Volunteers should contact their volunteer supervisor with any weather-related questions or concerns, but here is some information regarding weather-related cancellations. If the volunteer wishes to cancel, contact both the volunteer supervisor and the client promptly. If either is unavailable, leave a voicemail or email message. If SourcePoint cancels, the client and the volunteer will be notified promptly. If the client cancels, SourcePoint will notify the volunteer as promptly as possible. If driving during a tornado warning, exit the vehicle and seek shelter in a basement, low-lying area, or the safest place possible. Staying in the car should be the last resort. If driving during a flood watch or warning, avoid known flood areas and never attempt to cross flooded roads or bridges. If your car stalls in high water, stay in the vehicle and call 911. Snow or ice cancellations are based primarily on snow emergency levels set by the county sheriff. All transports are canceled during levels 2 and 3. Otherwise, cancellations are made on a case-by-case basis. SourcePoint staff monitor road conditions carefully. If it is safe to do so, almost every effort, will be made to provide service during inclement weather. Clients will be contacted proactively to determine their comfort level with the planned trip, as they will often choose to cancel appointments during icy or extremely cold weather conditions. SourcePoint will try to inform volunteers of passengers who have special needs. We never purposely accept passengers who require specialized medical services. Please report any concerns. Your feedback is a valuable tool for determining how best to serve the client. Please report all events adversely affecting physical and/or emotional health or involve any damage or theft to property. Incidents must be reported to the volunteer supervisor promptly, no matter who incited the event or who is at fault. Incidents come in many forms. Examples include a small cut requiring a Band-Aid, a trip and fall, or an argument between volunteer and client. If a passenger becomes ill, stay calm and use the cell phone to contact 911. Passengers who communicate distress should not be ignored. If a client falls and is unable to stand without assistance, the client should remain on the ground while the volunteer calls 911. Clients who have fallen might have sustained injuries that are not immediately apparent. Likewise, volunteers should not risk their own safety by lifting a client. If possible, make the client comfortable with a pillow and blanket while awaiting emergency response personnel. Clients who participate in SourcePoint's volunteer transportation program are expected to adhere to the following standards when using the program. We reserve the right to refuse service based on violations of these standards. Clients must give notification of the following: if a spouse or caregiver will be coming along on the transport, if the client has special vehicle needs, like no low sports cars or high pickup trucks, if oxygen will be used during the transport, if the client uses a mobility aid, such as a wheelchair, walker, or cane. If the appointment involves sedation, which requires the client to be accompanied by an individual responsible for their care and paperwork. Volunteers may not sign any paperwork on behalf of the client. If a client is unexpectedly informed that they will be receiving sedation at an appointment, the volunteer should call their volunteer supervisor for guidance. If the client requests that the volunteer accompany the client into the appointment. If a service animal with specialized training for performing functions related to the client's disabilities will be attending the client on the transport, the client must be in full control of the animal. These are some client expectations. We expect clients to be ready and waiting for the volunteer, except for coat and shoes. Wear a shirt and shoes and have good personal hygiene. Keep walkways, paths, and ramps on their property in good repair and free of ice and snow. Volunteers are not expected to shovel snow. Clients must be able to get in and out of a car with no more than light physical assistance. Wear a seatbelt unless they have a medical exemption. Clients must understand that they cannot ask the volunteer to make unauthorized stops for food, banking, etc. Exceptions include filling prescriptions or additional medical testing at the volunteer's discretion. Clients must always be considerate of the volunteer and their vehicle. Clients must follow these guidelines while riding in a volunteer's vehicle. No smoking or vaping. No eating or drinking unless permission has been given by the volunteer. No physical or sexual contact with the driver or other passengers. They must not have with them any objects defined as or intended to be used as weapons. No obscene, profane, or indecent language. No playing of any audio devices without the use of earphones. No passenger is allowed to solicit for any contributions. No opening windows or adjusting vehicle controls without permission. Regarding parking payment, the client is expected to be prepared to pay for parking, and volunteers are discouraged from offering to pay except if the volunteer opts for full pay lot for their own convenience. Volunteers must never sign documents on behalf of clients. A client may only bring a pet along with prior notice if it's transported in a store-bought carrier and always in the client's company. SourcePoint provides volunteer transportation to clients with dementia in specific circumstance. We will provide direct transportation to and from adult daycare. For any other transport, the client must have a caregiver ride along. In order to be eligible for volunteer transportation, clients with dementia must not have a history of wandering or of aggressive or disruptive behavior. Clients may call or send written complaints to SourcePoint. They have the right to request not to be matched with a volunteer with whom they have had a conflict, although every effort will be made to resolve the conflict. Sometimes volunteers and clients find that their personalities are not a good fit, and either party can request not to be matched with that person again. The volunteer supervisors keep a do not match list for this purpose. You made it through transportation policies, so the rest will be a breeze.